Take your seats and we can get started now. Quite impressive that we have this big room. It's, we didn't plan that and we had to change because there are so many of you here with us today. My name is Chris Burns. I'll be moderating this event. I do moderate a lot of events, but this one and this one is especially important. We're talking about green transition. We're talking about human rights. We're talking about due diligence. How do we make sure that those who are given these rules and regulations actually follow them in the green transition and in respecting human rights, not only in Europe but around the world? So that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking with policymakers, with businesses, SMEs, big and small, and with you as well. And that's very important as well for all of you here and all of you who are connected online. You can send in your questions on YouTube, in the YouTube chat, or here you can just raise your hand. So we do want to get you involved as much as possible. We want to make this as interactive as possible. You know, we have this House, this Parliament, 700 people voted that we have a climate emergency. Well, this is all part of that. The problem is that we have lots of rules and regulations, but there are a lot of them and a lot of guidelines, but they're not being followed. And a lot of it is voluntary. It's not working. And there's business climate impact as well. The Standard & Poor's study shows that CFOs and CEOs reported that 6% of their annual earnings were affected by extreme weather and climate events. So we need something EU-wide, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Also, if you hear anything that you'd like to cast wider, please do, #due diligence. Hélène, we're in how many languages translating, interpreting? 4?
Spanish, Italian, English.
Spanish, Italian, English, and French. Okay? Voilà. Donc, let's start with some opening comments by Iban Garcia del Blanco, S&D Coordinator of the Committee of Legal Affairs, JURI. Iban, por favor.
Gracias, Chris. Thank you, Chris. First of all, welcome to the European Parliament. Welcome you, dear friends, colleagues. I would like to warmly welcome you all to this workshop organized by our group, the Socialists and Democrats in the Legal Affairs Committee. I know that there are around 250 people in this room. That is amazing. It is awesome, and I assure you that this is not normal for any topic at all. So thank you very much for attending, because it's the real signal that this is an important debate, a very important and main important debate in this House and outside this House. And we have, by the way, many more online, at least more than 60. So the numbers, as I said, are impressive. The conversation we are hosting today aims to hear your voices. So thank you for responding to our call and for your participation in this exciting conference we are organizing on the future of the due diligence. I have no doubt that discussions will be fruitful around this captivating issue, which boils down to how we see the future of doing business in the world and how businesses can be instrumental in making the Green Deal a reality and making the world a better place for human rights, including social rights, of course. Since the beginning of the term, the Socialist Group is making calls for the introduction of ambitious legislation on the due diligence, and it has placed this topic as one of its top 10 topics, priorities, until the end of this mandate. Within the hands of Lara, at my left-hand side, Lara Wolters, and with the support of the many rapporteurs from opinion-giving committees, 3 of which are from our group and are here with us today, and thank you very much for attending too. Our group is leading the works in the European Parliament and paving the way towards a sustainable, responsible and fair way of doing businesses. I'm sure that this objective is close at hand. I'm so sure of this. Now, may the discussion begin. And I have to say that, unfortunately, I have previous appointments to attend as well, unavoidable appointments, so I have to leave. This is a pity for me, at least. And thank you very much for attending, and I'm so sorry to have to go. Thank you very much.
Iban, before I let you go, you said that the Americans are watching here, that they are interested in seeing how we do it here. I'm speaking as a European citizen. That's impressive, isn't it? This is going to be important to see what happens here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Iban, thank you. Muchas gracias. Thank you. Thank you to Iban. Lara Walters, welcome. Vice Chair of the Legal Affairs Committee. You have a report in committee next week, is that right? Coming up in committee next week, and with broad support, left, right, green. And I saw that the consultation on this involved 500,000 people. There is interest out there in trying to make this work. What difference would due diligence make at the end of the day in putting an end to abuses in environment and in human rights?
Before going into that question, I also wanted to say welcome to everyone here. And I will go into your question, and just in case people are thinking, oh gosh, another speech, we're not going to do a speech here, we're going to do a short Q&A and leave our esteemed panelists to deal with the really tough questions. But before doing that, I wanted to say welcome to everyone, and I am very heartened and impressed by the turnout here and online. And before forgetting also...
We're 170 viewers now. We jumped to 170.
That's really great, and I hope we can get some of the online participants to also put some questions or make some comments. But before forgetting or making sure it gets mentioned, I did want to also say a very, very warm thank you to Helene and to Andrea from the S&D, because they have put in a lot of work to get this group of people together, and I'm sure that will benefit our discussions here today. So if we can just, before starting, thank them, then that would be very kind of you. What was your question again?
How is all this work, how is all this work you're doing now going to make a difference? How could due diligence, if we get this through over the, past the goal line, what difference is that going to make in fighting abuses in human rights and environment abuse? Not only here, but abroad.
What we're after here is ensuring that there's no more looking away or no more companies, governments and others pointing at each other and saying, yes, but they're the real ones responsible, or they're the ones who have to fix this. And I think that pointing to each other, for me at the moment, is very visible in Qatar. To just throw in an example, if you look at the victims there building stadiums for our World Cup, for a party, no less, and if you look at the human rights abuses there and how they've been responded to, there's been a whole lot of companies pointing to each other, the Qatari government pointing to companies, then FIFA and Qatar pointing at each other. And at the end of the day, what this is about, which is respecting human rights, ensuring things like compensation and redress when needed, is not what gets focused on. And that, to me, that sort of pointing to each other or looking away is what we need to stop. And that's why, for me, the starting point of all this is the impact of this directive on the concrete impact on the environment, on human rights, on things like corruption.
Okay, now, there are statistics that show that a lot of businesses are not following voluntary procedures on this. So how can this help to push that along, to maybe establish a level playing field so that all businesses know they have to follow that rule, those rules?
There's a lot of voluntary initiatives, and I think that there's many amongst those that have been successful, at least in their take-up. I think one of the problems that we face is that there's companies that want to do more and that want to go faster than others, and then there's companies cutting corners and companies free riding or making a business model out of cutting corners. And that's what we need to avoid. And I think that voluntary schemes or sectoral schemes can be extremely helpful and can have a place here. This is a horizontal directive we're working on, meaning we're legislating here for a huge amount of sectors, and the impact of this hopefully will be felt throughout different continents even. But that means that there is a place also for giving more color to this legislation. But the take-up or the implementation or perhaps the enforcement of those measures, according to the Commission, which did that research, hasn't been sufficient, and indeed that's why now we need to put our money where our mouth is and make legislation out of this.
You've talked about a behavioral change that this could encourage among companies, all the way up to the boardroom. How can this help do that?
Boardrooms or those involved in companies on due diligence need to know what is expected. And I think that what is expected academically perhaps is quite clear. I mean, I don't think that we're reinventing the wheel here, and the United Nations Guiding Principles, the UNGPs on responsible business conduct or OECD guidelines on it are clear in that there's respect for human rights, there's respect for the environment that's required of companies, and what it means is companies taking a proactive interest in what goes on in their value chains. So that is what we're after, and that's the concrete change. But what I find important there too is the clarity for businesses, because just before coming here I was on a panel on ESG reporting, we were talking in that panel about how reporting, how that can drive change. And I challenged that assumption a little bit, because I said at the end of the day, transparency and reporting and data can only do so much in bringing about change, because if companies are left guessing on what it is that we want in order to achieve the Green Deal, for instance, then they can gather all the data they want and have data that's comparable and that can maybe give them insights, but it won't make clear what it is we need. And I think that that's the challenge for us here, to give much more clarity.
And what about beyond, as we discussed with Iban, the impact that it could have beyond Europe? I mean, and that Europe trades with the rest of the world, and we are collectively the largest economy in the world. How much impact could this legislation have beyond the borders of Europe?
The Parliament was very clear in its position previously that we're legislating for European companies here, but we're not only legislating on Europe here, because those European companies operate abroad, and so we're talking about impact outside of Europe, and the other way around. In the due diligence report we wrote, but also in reporting standards, we've made it clear that we think that this is a case of our market, our rules. Therefore, we need to find enforceable ways of making sure that companies who come to provide services or goods on our market, that they're also held to a certain standard when it comes to human rights and when it comes to the environment. And I think the reason that the Americans might be watching today, that sounds a little bit ominous, but is that, of course, this will impact on companies doing business in Europe. And maybe a little bit similarly to last week when we passed legislation on going towards one charger for mobile phones or for laptops. Or I would be surprised if American companies don't take note of that, because I don't think it's interesting for them to make a European and an American charger. And similarly, I think that our legislation here could benefit from sort of economies of scale when companies saying, well, if that's the standard or that's the direction of travel, then why don't we arrange our house so that those standards for us will be implemented no matter what, whether or not we're operating in Europe.
Now, this, as you mentioned, the European Commission proposed this legislation. What are a couple of items or aspects that you would like to amend or see changed in that legislation?
There's There's many, and I'll let experts go into that more on the panels. I mean, I think one of the very important things is that no matter what we do, I think that we need to always bear in mind why we're doing this and who we're doing it for. And I think what that means, if we're out looking for impact, then that also means that we need to stick very much to that famous risk-based approach as outlined by the UN. And a risk-based approach means that a starting point for a company is looking at where the biggest problems or the biggest risks could be and working from there, and not taking as a starting point, where do I have most power to change something? That for me is extremely important. Another point, I was at a very well-attended breakfast yesterday for SMEs. And SMEs, whilst not included by the European Commission, will definitely be impacted by this legislation. And the European Parliament was clear that SMEs and high-risk sectors should fall directly in scope. But even if they weren't to be in direct scope, they will be feeling this because they are part of the value chains of bigger companies. They will be asked to sign certain contracts with those larger companies. And I think to make sure that what is required of them is proportionate, feasible, and so forth, we need to, from my point of view, include them, at least those in risk sectors, and make sure that they get the support that they need.
In fact, we're going to be talking to some SMEs, people representing SMEs today. That'll be very important to have that input as well. What about the victims of social abuses, of, well, Mother Earth? How can this due diligence help them?
In terms of Mother Earth, I don't know if any of the other panelists can speak to that, but there's this interesting legal concept, I think, being developed at the moment of giving legal status to the Earth, which could come into this, and the concept of ecocide, of course. But now I need to remember what your question was. Your question was?
Well, I mean, how much does this due diligence legislation give recourse to those who are looking for justice, who need a hand?
So I think in its current form, the proposal doesn't take that as a starting point, or doesn't quite address that properly. I think that it's been mentioned many times that the word remedy doesn't feature in the Commission's proposal. The Parliament was also clear on the reversal of the burden of proof. Now I'm sure that will be a very tough cookie to crack here, but we said that it's important that those seeking access to justice, those who've been wronged, that that nothing stands in their way of getting to justice. And I think that taking barriers away from them is very important and needs to be addressed in the legislation. I think that more needs to be done there. I think we also need to look at how can we ensure that if a European company has been causing or contributing, how can we make sure that we don't get into the situation of judges in third countries far away saying, well, no, actually, I won't be, this claim isn't admissible here, and victims may be falling between the ship and the shore, as we say in Dutch. That's all, I think, a very important focus of this report, but I'm sure that we'll have very difficult discussions and negotiations on this, because this gets to the core of what many companies fear, of course, which is the liability regime and what actually they can be held liable for.
So how do you strike that balance? Because I'm sure we're going to hear some input, feedback today saying this goes too far. How do you strike the balance here?
I don't know that I can say that we will be able to strike some sort of mathematical balance or a scientifically approved balance. I think that policy making is a very, very difficult thing to do if you're after keeping everyone happy. But I do think that we've got a few anchoring points that will be important here. We do have the established concepts of causing harm, contributing to harm, or being linked to harm, which are rather different. I think also there's a difference between responsibility and liability, what we expect companies to do even if they don't have a lot of leverage in other situations. I think that the European Commission has made a start that we can build on by saying, well, there's two conditions that need to be fulfilled, for there to be liability. One is, your due diligence architecture in your company, you know, is flawed. And secondly, if that then causes harm, then there's a case to be made. And so I think that we've got elements here that we can work with, but I'm not naive about how tough the negotiations on this are going to be.
And I think we'll get indications from the talk today how complex it is. What would final thought before we go to our first panel? What would be a successful event today in your regard?
I suppose a successful event today is one where we hear differing points of view and where there's clashes as well. I don't think that anyone wants to sit in a room and listen to a lot of people agreeing with each other. But if we can walk out of the room today saying, yes, it's going to be difficult. Yes, the current context of a war, inflation, and so forth is difficult. And yet we need to overcome those difficulties, and we need to all put our shoulders under legislation that actually makes an impact. Then I would be very happy.
Okay, Lara, thank you very much. We'll come back to you a little bit later. Thank you, Lara. Thank you. If I could call up the first panel, Emily Norton, Responsible Business Conduct, with OECD. If you could bring your card. Yeah, everybody bring your cards. Phil Bloomer, Executive Director, Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Pedro Oliveira, Director, Business Europe. And, yeah, the three of you. And the title of this first conversation is Ensuring Impact and Feasibility, ESG, Environmental Social Governance, Value Chain, Liability. These are all very, very tough issues to deal with in due diligence. But if we don't have due diligence, all this legislation we have on Fit for 55, green transition, what all is really not worth the paper it's written on unless you can have accountability, and that's what due diligence is all about, isn't it? So we will have a couple of rounds with the panel, and then we'll toss it out to you. We hope to get your questions in. Also send them in too, via, for those of you who are online, please send them in the YouTube chat. Let's start with Emily. Hello, Emily. Hello, all of you. Responsible business conduct via OECD. You're in that unit at the OECD. Can you tell us a few words about the OECD guidelines? And I think we want to tear out some pages from that and put, that's what's kind of in this due diligence legislation, isn't it?
No, thank you. And thank you again to Lara and the team for the invitation today. And very much looking forward to the event. Sorry, yeah. I hope you can hear me better now.
Yeah, much better.
No, thanks again to Lara and the team for the invitation, and to Chris for moderating. No, I think from our side, just to set out the OECD guidelines, they are government-backed recommendations to business on responsible business conduct, and they're the most comprehensive international instrument on RBC because they cover a broad range of environmental, social, and governance issues. And at their core, they have a concept that whilst business can do a lot of good, business can help progress on a range of environmental, social issues, they also can cause harm. Yeah. And so there is therefore an expectation that businesses, that's where the core expectation is set out, that businesses find and address the harms that they do cause.
Okay. But what are some of the differences between what OECD has proposed in terms of guidelines and what the European Commission has proposed?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, firstly, just to say that I think in many ways we have welcomed the Commission proposal. It's an ambitious proposal. There's very strong reference to our standards and the standards of the UN. There's also a strong effort to incorporate the value chain. So I think those are important points to make. On the other hand, it's the tricky balance that Lara was referring to. There is a very tricky balance, which we also have to juggle in our standards between flexibility and legal certainty. And I think probably I'd raise 3 points where I think in some cases there's too much flexibility, too little flexibility. One would be the risk prioritization that Lara just touched on very briefly, but and the role of leverage. And the point there really is that companies need to be able to prioritize. They cannot address all of their RBC impacts at the same time with the same degree of effort. That's just not feasible, and it's also not effective for the people who are being harmed at the other end of the chain. If they need to be able to prioritize, then there need to be clear parameters. What does that mean? On the basis of what factors? And that under our standards, and the same with the UN, it's very clear that prioritization is only on the basis of the severity and likelihood of the harm. How much control you have over a supplier does not influence whether or not you prioritize.
Can you give a concrete example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, so for example, if you're dealing, and I mean, I'm speaking to businesses about this at the moment actually, but if you're dealing in the garment sector, for example, you'll often find there's a very natural tendency actually to look at your sort of tier one manufacturers where there might be overtime issues, living wage issues. Those are quite sometimes very important impacts to address. There might well be very important issues that are coming up, but there can be a tendency to address them at those suppliers because they are the largest supplier, because they're sort of closer to home, and those issues can be found and addressed quite quickly, compared to even in the same supplier, something like child labour, freedom of association, much trickier issues often to deal with. And then, of course, there's the entire upstream supply chain, the cotton fields. You know, there's an assumption that actually you start at tier one, whereas maybe the most significant impacts, as we know from quite a bit of research, are not always in that tier one section of the supply chain.
Okay, let me move on. We can come back to you. Phil Bloomer, Executive Director, Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Phil, would you say that that the Commission proposal allows to address the main challenges of due diligence, which voluntary standards we're failing to address?
Thanks very much, and thanks again for the organisation of this event. I do think at the moment that the draft directive is an extraordinary step forward. And it's being therefore watched around the world, as we heard from Lara. And, you know, literally a few weeks ago, we were contacted by the Chinese Apparel Business Association to seek more explanation as to why, as to what this would mean for Chinese. So in terms of that broader international impact, it's substantial. I think, again, in terms of we, as the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, have monitored and tracked various of the voluntary approaches. We know that they have a really important impact, but in a relative minority of companies, the responsible and leading companies that want to do more, that want to distinguish themselves by their ethical responsibilities, they will use those voluntary standards to distinguish themselves, but also to drive innovation in these areas of responsible business conduct in their own operations and supply chains. So if you look, for instance, but what it doesn't do, those voluntary, is actually deal with the majority of companies. The majority of companies that do not see responsible business conduct as a primary responsibility, either for the board or for the purchases that they send out through their supply chains. And this is where the mandatory nature of the corporate sustainability and due diligence directive will make a profound difference by bringing in not only that responsibility, but also the civil liability around it. And therefore, as Commissioner Reinders said when he started this whole process, to change the calculus of risk in boardrooms, to change the business model, to actually make sure that that business model makes companies start to absorb and understand the risks in their supply chains, as Emily said, but also act on them, and rather than simply accepting that there's going to be some damage along the way and that will be externalized through greenhouse gas pollution or other pollutions, or through paying the lowest wages by price gouging, through sending young men out from their brands to go to Cambodia and ask for a further 10% discount on the apparel, on the clothing, knowing that that will mean further reductions in wages of women workers in those factories.
Okay, so you like what's on paper, but how do you ensure that it will actually have impact, that there will be tangible benefits?
Well, again, what we need to see is really powerful, a really powerful directive, first of all, but then also the implementation to make sure that that happens. That will happen partly through all the member states and the Commission really having the administrative and implementation units that are necessary to ensure that this is being properly regulated and observed through what the companies are actually coming up with. And that's it's perfectly feasible to be able to do that. But what we also need is that investment in the companies through ODA and other into the investment that's necessary in the companies in the South as well as in Europe and into civil society. And it's the trade unions, the environmentalists, the women's organisations and the indigenous organisations that will also play a fundamentally active role, as they do with us. You know, we've taken up 900, since 2020, we've taken up 900 allegations of abuse against European companies. And they have come from those grassroots organisations asking simply for a reasonable access to justice and redress.
Let me go to Pedro. You're head of legal affairs over at Business Europe, which represents businesses all over Europe. And do you think that this legislation strikes a good balance? And this idea, I guess, of businesses hate unpredictability. They want predictability. They want that level playing field. Do you think this establishes a level playing field that puts it in the interest of all businesses to follow those rules?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Chris, for the question. Very happy to be here representing Business Europe. Just to put it out there that Business Europe welcomes a EU regime on mandatory due diligence. I just wanted to clarify that. I think it's important to start this debate. There is the clear benefits of having a good piece of legislation, but we still think that there is some way to go to get the balance right. A few examples is that we tend to see this, there is a kind of a more punitive approach rather than an educational and enabling approach in the proposal. Because for us, we need to, the due diligence is about a process. It's about identifying problems, about solving them. And if you are too strict, if you are punishing those who are trying to do the right thing, then people will simply do not engage and they will just pull out of markets. So from our perspective, we need to move from this punitive to a more endorsing and more enabling approach in the directive. It was said already here today by the colleague from the OECD, we need to have concepts like prioritization given more emphasis, risk-based. There's some terminology which is rather vague, and companies need clarity to be able to act. And then, finally but not least, the level playing field that has also been mentioned today is simply not there. So we are talking about a directive, we're talking about a legal basis which is to promote the internal market, to promote the level playing field, similar rules. Let's not forget that sustainability is not a national problem. It's not an European problem, it's a global problem. So to ensure coherence, we need rules that are really, truly harmonized.
Can you elaborate on why it's not a level playing field?
Let's first start with the fact that it's a minimum harmonization directive, where member states have total and utterly freedom to top off, to add new things to the proposal. And this is quite problematic because it will not help companies to operate in this clear space, as Emily was mentioning earlier. And also, if you look into the thresholds under the scope, there is a clear discrimination between European companies and third country companies. And this needs to be addressed. So we need this level playing field to be addressed on these two different dimensions.
Well, that's probably a tough nut to crack to get all the EU 27 to enforce equally, isn't it? I mean, try to be realistic about this.
I'm realistic, and this House has adopted many directives which include a full harmonization clause, so an internal market clause. You see that in a lot of consumer rights directives that have been adopted just 2 or 3 years ago, and many in the last 10 years. So there is clearly a legal way to ensure more coherence and consistency in terms of reaching this harmonization. Absolutely.
And what about the idea of, I mean, how far back do you go in your supply chain for due diligence? I think that's probably a key question, right? And I think you wanted first tier, but maybe that's not effective enough.
Let's say that companies, I mean, the word expectations has been mentioned today, and for us, we need to have realistic and also reasonable expectations on what companies can do. I mean, there is a clear distinction between the right to protect or the duty to protect of states and the duty to respect. Companies lie under the duty to respect the law. So companies are not policemen. So there are clear limitations on what companies can achieve. And this idea of a privatization of protection of human rights is not so easy to achieve, because then you will need to give police powers to companies. So I think via the concepts such as prioritization and also working better on the liability provisions, I think we can get there, but there is still some long way, and I'm happy then to discuss more in detail some ideas on that.
Okay, great. Do we have anyone out in the audience who would like to pose a question? Yes, Rob.
Hi, thank you, and thank you to MEP Walters of the S&D for organising here today. My name is Richard Gardner with the World Benchmarking Alliance, and at WBA we published the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, which provides a comparative yearly snapshot looking at how companies respond to the human rights impact. In November this year we'll publish the updated benchmark, but just to give you an insight, so far our research is showing that carrying out impactful human rights due diligence is both positively correlated with board-level remuneration and directors' duty of care. And so what this means and what we're seeing is that companies with board-level policy commitments to respect human rights are performing better than those that don't make such a commitment. And in effect, it's creating a virtuous circle within the company. And so my question to the panel is, given these positive correlations we're seeing, how important do you think such an integrated approach is, and how vital is it to legally mandate senior management responsibility for due diligence plans and processes to achieve meaningful due diligence? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry, I gave you the wrong name. Any other questions at this point before I go on with other? Yep. Yes, please. Identify yourself, please.
Giuseppe Cioffo, SITSE, the International Family of Catholic Social Justice Organizations. Two questions. One on prioritization. We agree it is a better approach than what's currently in the Commission's proposal. How do we ensure the impacts that happen and that have been prioritized as law are not used, that prioritization is not used as a shield, in this case, for a company's responsibility? And a question for Business Europe. We hear the proposal is too strict, but it's also too vague. What does that mean? And if they could be more specific in what elements they would like to see more clarity on. Thank you.
Okay, who would like to take that? At least the first question, then we go to Business Europe.
Well, shall I take the prioritization
go ahead,
question first? Just to say, very much an area of interest for us, and I think it's really important that our standards speak to this point in the sense that they don't only say that businesses should prioritize on the basis of specific factors, so severity and likelihood, both defined, and so that could be reflected in a law to exclude the leverage aspects I was talking about earlier. But also then you could have, and we would recommend having more robust criteria for what the prioritization process looks like, and that would mean, prioritization processes that flow across the full due diligence process would involve, for example, robust stakeholder engagement, meaningful stakeholder engagement to ensure that your prioritization process is credible. And also it involves very much setting out, for example, clear expectations at what we call the high-level risk scoping level to ensure that already at the very, very outset of your due diligence, you are already looking at the right, most significant RBC risk issues. And that involves, again, stakeholder engagement, but it also does get lost a little bit in the debate that I think sometimes I'll focus on GHG emissions and I'll look at forced labor and all these labor risks, when actually sitting back and doing the scoping phase and prioritizing exactly which risks you're addressing and why, and have you done a proper prioritization process at that point, then flows through the whole process. And then I just end quickly, if that's okay, to say that critical, of course, is that then business can demonstrate all of that they can demonstrate a proper process, and that means, of course, clear being able to demonstrate either publicly or on request to authorities, depending on how the law is defined, but showing, or at least able to show that they have engaged with meaningful stakeholders, that why they have prioritized in certain ways, what their justifications are, And then just on the flip side, of course, businesses should not be unreasonably sanctioned where they then do prioritize.
Phil, you wanted to interject something before we go back to Pedro.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, just to say, thanks for the question from the World Benchmarking Alliance. The, Shift ourselves and the Anti-Slavery International have reached out to a large number of European companies, large, small, from various sectors, all of which are very much in favour of the civil liability and the due diligence directive. And it's important to say, I mean, I was with a vice president from one of the largest apparel manufacturers in Europe only a couple of weeks ago, and he said three things to me. He said, first of all, Phil, that regulation drives board attention. So if we want board attention, we need this regulation, and we need it to have the penalties, not against the responsible companies, but against those irresponsible companies. Secondly, he said that human rights and environmental due diligence regulation is beneficial to our company, and that's what the point that you were making from the World Benchmarking Alliance. And then thirdly, he said that human rights and environmental due diligence regulation is not a threat to nearshoring of production, against, unfortunately, what Pedro's suggested. He said that's highly unlikely. If nearshoring were to occur, it would happen because of geopolitics or because of the need to build much greater resilience because of the economic turbulence. So I think the key thing here is that there's over 100 major European companies and investors that have spoken out in favour of due diligence and civil liability. They believe that their long-term futures really depend upon this legislation because they do not want to be undercut by cowboy companies that are prepared to cut the corners, as Lara mentioned earlier. But they also recognise that it's important for their investments, particularly as ESG investment grows, and it's growing rapidly still at the moment. And it's also important for the workers and the communities that their profits depend upon.
I like that. There's one tweet there, hashtag due diligence on cowboy companies, right? That's what are you hearing, Pedro, in answering the question also about that, what Phil just said? Is that what you're hearing also on the ground among Business Europe members?
I mean, just to be on the clear side, we don't like cowboy companies, of course, because the companies that we represent, which more than 20 million, they want to do the right thing. They want to do business in a safe environment. They want that their competitors also act in a proper way and do not engage in illegal behaviors and cutting corners. I don't think any company that I represent would like to be put in that corner of the cowboys. So that's what one expects. But then I would like to pick up the questions that came from the audience because I thought they were very interesting, and it's part of the debate right now about the board members. A board member has to deal also with compliance. So whether it be competition, insolvency law, I mean, there's plenty of legislation that has to arrive to the boards because they are ultimately responsible to make sure that the company follows the rules. Once due diligence, a mandatory EU framework on due diligence becomes part of the body of rules that companies have to follow, boards cannot say no. Boards have to be responsible and they will listen. So it tends to be a little bit misleading that we also have to add new liabilities on new duties on directors because they will already have to be following the new rules. Also, if you put direct liability on board members for anything that happens in value chains or supply chains, I think it will be very difficult to have directors in companies taking risks, because being entrepreneurial, going beyond your comfort zone is about taking risks to produce, and actually you need prosperity to meet planet and people. So you need a strong prosperity and strong companies and companies that are able to take risks and to evolve, provide innovation, etc. So in a way, first, if you go too far in terms of the liabilities on directors, you will not have such an entrepreneurial necessary behavior from the boards, and you will also have difficulties to find board members. I'm a vice president of a company, and I'm not sure I would be sitting in the same board if I know that there is an unlimited liability that will fall on my shoulders, independently on the type of negligence or other types of bad behavior. So I just wanted to address that point, and then to address the point that was raised earlier as well about the vagueness and the strictness. So there's both. It's paradoxical, but there is both, because the vagueness is about some of the as I mentioned before, some of the concepts. The concept of stakeholder is basically anything that moves on this earth. Then established business relationship. This is a concept that has been criticized across the board, not only from Business Europe, but from many people. I think the colleagues, I see some noddings. And also the material norms. We have an annex with 6 pages with mostly state-to-state conventions, which most of them are not applicable to companies. So there is vagueness. And then in terms of strictness, I mean, you have a lot of obligations in terms of stopping or blocking contractual obligations. So there is indirectly harmonization of contract law at European level with impact on relationships beyond other laws as well in third states. So there are multiple examples of strictness that will simply make it difficult to apply this legislation in practice.
We just topped 300 viewers, and to all those 300 viewers out there, you're welcome to send in your questions, as well as here. Before we go on, let us turn to Timo Volken, who is on the Environment Committee. Timo, perhaps a bit of feedback. Might you have a question for some or several on the panel right now?
Thank you very much, Chris. It's good to see you again. And as you rightly pointed out, I'm responsible in the ENVI committee for our opinion to Lara's work. And I would like to thank all panelists today for their remarks. I would have a question for everyone, or even two. So starting with Emily, you pointed out the OECD guidelines, and they are obviously very important. They are also the foundation for our work, or for my work in the ENVI committee. In fact, I think that the Commission proposal would have been way better if they had more oriented itself on the OECD guidelines. I think a key point you mentioned is flexibility. So you mentioned the importance of risk prioritization and leverage. So obviously companies of different sizes and in different industries have different challenges. And leverage. So my question would be, how do we ensure that this flexibility, which is part of your guidelines, is translated into the legal text that is actually legal sound, so to avoid more vagueness? I do think there is quite a risk that we introduce loopholes which companies could use to escape their obligations. And turning to Phil, you mentioned the value that voluntary standards bring in terms of motivating a few companies to go above and beyond to distinguish themselves from the competition. Do you think that the due diligence directive could be a catalyst to drive all European companies to be more ambitious and become frontrunners on adapting our economy to the challenges of climate change? So, if so, do you think the current provisions on climate transition plans are sufficient or should be more ambitious? And finally, turning to Pedro, you said that the due diligence is about the process. I don't think that I would not agree with this, but what we don't want is an empty paper tiger or an empty checklist with just the tick the box approach. So I would also agree that we need as much harmonization as possible, but I wanted to ask specifically at your point on third country companies, after all. Any company waiting to do business in Europe is in the scope of the CSDD. And they would have to comply with its rules. In this context, I would be more than interested to hear about how you think we can get harmonization and a level playing field, given the obvious limitations that we are making European laws here, and unfortunately not global ones. And I just also have two more critical remarks. We constantly create new labels, and industry constantly keeps on telling consumers to adapt their behavior, to become better consumers. Don't you think it's time for companies to step up as well? especially given that you just called sustainability a global challenge. And one last remark. In your last intervention, you mentioned that if we would introduce directors' duties, there would be less people willing to join a board of a company. This makes me afraid, to be honest. So I want to have responsible people at the board, and I want them to take responsibility for their company and for their actions, and not to avoid it. I hope that maybe I got it wrong, so then please correct me, but if this is true, I would be a bit scared. And one final thing, if you think the annexes are vague, would a list of directly applicable obligations, for instance, on the environment in the definition help? That's all. Thank you very much once again.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Timo. Emily, can we go to you first? I mean, how do we get it closer to OECD guidelines? Is that possible?
No, thank you, and thanks for the question. And it's obviously a favorite of, at the moment, it feels. I think maybe just to say that the risk-based approach, as we call it, which can mean, I'm not sure everyone always understands that in the way that we would, but that's the risk prioritization. So on severity and likelihood, but that's also about tailoring your approaches throughout the whole due diligence process to the nature of the risk and the severity of the risk. That's not a new concept. So Anti-Money Laundering, Bribery Act, we have laws out there that, and I mean, food safety legislation, there's a whole range of legislation out there that asks companies to take a risk-based approach. It's within a different remit of risks, it's in a very specific policy context with a different scope, but the idea behind taking proportionate risk-based measures, dialing up and down according to the degree of risk, is not a new concept for business. So I think that's maybe just something to add. But in terms of that flexibility and how that's translated, I mean, looking at, I'm not a legal expert on all these issues, but you can draw from some of those different approaches, like anti-money laundering in some ways. But I think how we would present it in this context and in our standards is that, yes, there's quite a lot of flexibility, but there's also prescription. There are parameters. So it's about getting those parameters in there. And some of them I mentioned earlier around stakeholder engagement at the right points at the right time, the right type of stakeholder engagement with the right, but also giving business that flexibility again to be able to it's very context specific. The stakeholders that are relevant at a particular time will not be relevant at another point in time for another company in another sector. So I think ultimately it really comes back to the checks and safeguards I touched on a little bit earlier, whether it's stakeholder engagement, but also the target setting that companies are expected to put into place. They should be setting, again, with stakeholder engagement, targets that they then report against to show progress. And that's how it's those sorts of checks and balances that show that companies might be prioritizing, they might be taking different approaches, but what are they demonstrating? How are they demonstrating it? Are they showing progress over time publicly? And then actually governments do have an opportunity to demand a bit more information. And I think why not demand a bit more on, if there are questions on prioritization on major issues, we might be talking about Xinjiang solar panels. Why are you not looking for alternative markets? What are you doing? There could be questions and there could be demands for information. So I think that's the general approach, is actually that the demonstration, the public reporting element is actually critical, and that's where, of course, we move towards CSRD discussion. But the granularity of that reporting is really critical. And so can I just very quickly touch on the climate point, because it was an interesting question you were asking about the climate plan, which I won't particularly speak to, but just to say that I think we at the OECD do see the omission of the Paris Agreement in the due diligence framework as a major missed opportunity. And I think there's maybe quite a lot of misunderstanding or confusion, and by the way, I'm not an environmental expert, but I'm told by my environmental colleagues that there is quite a lot of confusion out there about what's going on in the climate space. There is a lot going on. There's a lot being demanded of business in some contexts on very specific issues in very specific sectors. And then there's a lot going on in the voluntary space where there's a lot, pathways, targets, benchmarks, disclosure, but there's nothing on conduct. And there's nothing that's saying actually, there's nothing on conduct, and therefore you miss a huge amount of the value out of due diligence, which means there's nothing on the process to get you there. There's nothing on engaging with stakeholders. There's nothing about getting this into your governance systems. There's nothing about taking into account the social impacts of your net zero plans so there's all of the elements of due diligence are lost. So I think I'll let Phil talk to the plan itself, but.
Okay, we pitch it off to Phil. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Timo. Those are really important reflections, I think. I mean, just in terms of that issue about the voluntary drive to better practice, I think it's demonstrated, and we've done a renewable energy benchmark, the Renewable Energy Human Rights benchmark, and in there you can see that a number of European companies score very, very highly. At least one, RWE, does not. And so there are leaders and laggards in Europe, but there is that drive, and that's come from some of those voluntary efforts that have been made. So that is important from our side. But I think what's critical is, of course, that we all recognise that we're standing on the edge of a precipice regarding climate catastrophe. And therefore, it's fundamentally important that we get the fast and fair transition that we need. And I say fair and fast because we can only get the fast transition if it's also a fair transition to clean energy. Unfortunately, at the moment, we're taking up a very large number of allegations regarding the renewable energy companies and regarding transition minerals. We know that there's got to be massive investment in those two fields. There's got to be massive investment. The International Energy Agency says that the extraction rates for minerals such as copper and cobalt, lithium, manganese, nickel, zinc, they've got to increase by an average of 6 times by 2040 if we're going to reach the 2050 targets. So that extraordinary expansion means an enormous demand for land that's often held by indigenous people. What's happening at the moment, unfortunately, is in too many cases, that's creating a culture of resistance because indigenous people only see the confiscation of their land and the dispossession, and therefore the annihilation of their indigenous nation. With that, we cannot continue and have a fast transition. So bringing in that due diligence, bringing in the corporate environmental due diligence is going to be critical, as well as the human rights due diligence, and those two things go intimately together. To mention the companies that do better, it's Iberdrola, it's EDF, it's Acciona Energy. These are the companies that are way out ahead. They're making good money. These people, these companies are not loss-making ventures. They're making extremely good money. Why is it not that the other companies can at least follow suit? And that is essentially the raising of the floor that this due diligence directive should give. I want to just finish, though, by saying one other element that comes, and I could go on about the transition minerals, but in this area, we have taken up last year 615 allegations of abuse against human rights and environmental defenders. Now, more than 70% of those allegations of abuse come from environmental, land, and climate defenders. People who are seeking to do the right thing, making sure there's responsible business investment in those areas that does not violate the fundamental rights of communities and workers. And so it's for that. Now, those people are being silenced through intimidation and through threats and indeed through violence. And that cannot continue if we're going to get due diligence, if we're actually going to get that stakeholder engagement. Because you attack one of those people, you silence 100. And so fundamentally important for all the businesses to be effective in the fair and fast transition that we need is also the voice of those human rights defenders. And if this works, many of those transition mineral companies and the renewable energy companies will actually find, and that many of them are now welcoming the draft. I spoke with a senior figure in the Global Wind Energy Council just last week who said our members welcome this, and they welcome the civil liability alongside it, because they see that this approach will actually allow them to bring in the kind of co-benefit that's necessary. If you look at Rio, and I'll finish now, but if you just look at what Rio Tinto's up against at the moment, it's just had its own license with a lithium mine revoked in Serbia because of opposition from communities, because the consultation was not there. And secondly, it's just done something very important. It's taken a really important initiative, which is to say we are now in a co-management arrangement with the PKKP community because in terms of the exploitation of minerals in the Yukon Gorge after the extraordinary disaster that they had only 2 years ago. And why? Because they recognize that the indigenous people know so much more about that territory and that land than they do. And therefore, that co-management model is fundamentally important. And that's what should come from this due diligence process, and why it's so important for so many indigenous people, trade unions, and environmental and women's organizations.
Pedro, I know you had a lot of questions to
Yes.
answer there. How do we avoid this becoming a paper tiger? And I'd like to fit in, hopefully, one more question from the audience after that, before we move on to the next panel, because the time is running down.
Thank
Pedro,
you,
please.
thank you, Chris. Well, indeed, there were a few questions. Companies, they don't want a box-ticking exercise with this. Absolutely not, because this, I mean, we need meaningful due diligence, and by having just box-ticking, this will not solve anything. And then also to address what Mr. Volken was saying, when our company is stepping up, yes, they are stepping up, because, I mean, not only, due diligence is not the panacea. I mean, they don't operate in a vacuum. They have a lot of environmental legislation, social. I mean, Europe is quite a bulk of legislation that is thrown on companies, so they do not operate in a vacuum. They need to take that into account, of course. And their consumers, their investors, their shareholders, local communities, everybody's having expectations on companies. So if they do not also move to the space of being more conscientious on sustainability, they will disappear, basically. They will disappear. So companies are stepping up and will have to continue to step up further and further. So on your point on the harmonization, making this a level playing field, so as I explained, an internal market clause, then on the third country companies, there is a clear difference between how we calculate the thresholds. So what we ask is to level, to make them, that you calculate basically the same way, because now on the external companies is on their European turnover, whilst on European companies is on the global turnover, so you make a bit of discrimination there. You might capture much less third country companies. Then on the aspect of the director's duties, I don't want to be misunderstood. There are director's duties. There are director's duties in the member states. I mean, there is company law. I mean, in Europe, everywhere, and at least 14 directives on company law. So there are director's duties that are applicable to directors. They are liable. In Belgium, I know that I'm liable up to 2 or 3 million euros. So there are director's duties. What my point was that what this directive tries to achieve is a doubling down. So he's adding directors' duties when they are already there, and eventually could disrupt a bit the company laws in the member states. And I have not seen from the Commission any study that justifies intervention in directors' duties, and why it is justified to go into that space. So I just wanted to raise this as well, because at the end we need to also to operate within better regulation as well.
Okay, I'm allowed to go a little bit into overtime. I'd like to take one or two questions, please, sir.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Julian Lajar from Intel. Phil, you mentioned minerals, and I think, Emily, you mentioned the CSRD. I just wanted to make a point about coherence with existing legislation. And by the way, we're very supportive of the CS3D, but also the forced labour instrument as well. But we need very, very clear guidance because there's existing due diligence legislation. It's ironic in a nice way that in this very room we had the inter-public hearing on conflict minerals all those years ago. And those of you who were involved, we spent many, many years building up this elaborate regulatory and accompanying measure structure that built on the Dodd-Frank Act in the US. We spent a lot of time in this very house building the system for the 3TG minerals. Yet, of course, with the CS3D, it's all other minerals with their value chains. And this has been built in a specific way under the OECD minerals guidelines. So under the minerals regulation, we also got the provision in to recognise certain industry schemes, not to replace companies' efforts, to complement companies' efforts, based on the OECD methodology. And we really need to look at the minerals regulation, the batteries regulation, the product sustainability regulation, the link between the CSRD and the CS3D, and also the link between the forced labour instrument and the CS3D. So we've got to make sense of it all to make it work, but we can't destroy what we've built up over our best part of 2 decades on the mineral supply chains, and we need very strong and clear guidance.
I guess that's more a statement than a
Yeah,
question.
sure,
If we can move to the next question, then we'll wrap it up. Please, if you could be brief. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martina Rogato. Martina Rogato from Impresa 2030, Italian coalition of NGOs focused on BHR. So how can we avoid this directory will be transformed into a simple compliance exercise, for example, on those not established business relationship? And this is an issue because a company could comply with the due diligence, but not in their temporary business relations. And if you have in mind any, let's say, digital tools for developing due diligence, because as we know, is not so easy, it's not so simple. We thank OECD for their guidelines, but concerning environmental issues is more technological, but with social issues is very challenging, time-consuming, and lots of economical investments. So thank you.
Grazie, molto grazie. I guess, Emily, maybe you might have some advice on digital tools?
Well, personally, less on the digital tools. We do have a digital team who are working that I can put you in touch with, but I was going to answer more the, if that's okay, the avoiding compliance box ticking. I mean, I think that's where some of us probably are all aligned on the panel, actually. But I think from my side, and maybe something I should have added earlier in terms of the prescription from the standards. First, we are dealing with voluntary standards that do have more flexibility than is going to be realistic in a law. I think that has to be recognised, and there will be terms and concepts that need to be refined. But by the way, on some of those and some of the parameters I mentioned earlier that sort of act as safeguards to that flexibility are numerous. And I gave one example of stakeholder engagement, but there might be also, for example, I can give you, there's clear process on disengagement, the triggers for when disengagement might be appropriate, when it's not, and why it's important that it's not too black and white, as we think the Commission proposal is. There's also clear parameters on, for example, if you're responding to impacts, if you're causing, you have a heightened expectation, there's a remedy expectation, if you're contributing, similar, and then if it's your business partner. So I think building in all the specificity and building on it, because we appreciate it, you know, it is up to governments as to how to then refine and define, but that should help towards what you're talking about. And I think, again, I mentioned the targets earlier, but maybe just to say that I think some of these concepts, and probably having to end soon anyway, but maybe as a sort of concluding, I think some of the concepts where we are refining a bit further, or where we're introducing new concepts, as the one you just referred to, you know, I think it's on governments to really think, and policymakers to really think, is that, like, what are the consequences of that in a very practical way, in terms of this, how this not just will be written, but how it will be then implemented by companies, and what does that mean for how does due diligence serve the people it's designed to serve? And then, you know, is it undermining ultimately the risk-based principles? These new concepts, are they undermining risk-based principles? And actually, that governments have endorsed, business have endorsed, industry associations have already endorsed, and why are they there? And why should we be upholding them? And I think these sorts of questions really need to be asked as we're preparing these laws. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Emily, to Pedro, and to Phil. Big hand to them, please. So we're talking about risk-based. We're going to talk to SMEs. How long should the long arm of the EU be when it comes to regulating SMEs and due diligence? And we'll talk to also the finance side as well, the banking side. I'd like to call up Luke Hendricks of SME United, JURI Herder of Business and Human Rights Advisor at ABN AMRO Bank, and Julie Simon, Senior Research and Advocacy Officer at Finance Watch, who is also ex-State Street and ex-Commerzbank, so quite knowledgeable about finance. So if we could call them up. If you could bring your cards, yes, your ID cards, so we can put those up. I guess, are we covered on that? Okay. Yeah, I think this is also a very, very critical issue about how much should SMEs be responsible for due diligence. And if they're not, then it doesn't go far enough, right? So, yeah, okay. I think they're here, right? Okay. No, that's fine. That's good. Okay. Oh, and I'm sorry, Gaël de Sepulcre, Deputy Director, Globalization Desk at FIDE, International Federation for Human Rights, or Fédération Internationale pour les Droits Humains. Pardon, excusez-moi. Je suis désolé. Why don't we start then with Luke Hendricks and the question of how you think SMEs will be impacted by this proposal. Luke.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the invitation. Maybe in order to set the scene, and I hope that we already come up with a, would I say, a statement on which we can have a general approval, is that SME United is in favor, and I repeat, is in favor of a European due diligence legislation that works and that is workable, and that is also proportional to the limited possibilities of SMEs. I think this should be our starting point. Having said this, on the consequences for SMEs, there are two things. First of all, and I'm going to refer to what Pedro has said and echo what he has said concerning the actual shortcomings or unclarities in the proposal of the Commission. Because there, as said by Business Europe, in the proposal of the European Commission, there are a lot of uncertainties, and there is a lot of freedom given to the member states in order to go further, or also, and I think this has also been mentioned, a lot of definitions in the proposal are not very clear and leave consequently a lot of freedom and interpretation, room for interpretation for the member states. So as such, we cannot yet judge the input or the effects of SMEs at national level. A second issue is, and a lot has been said, are now SMEs in the scope of the directive, yes or no? I think that the answer is clearly yes, they are, of course, in the scope. And when the Commission is saying that 99% of the companies are excluded of the directive, I think this is merely a political declaration. We have seen the same with the CSRD, saying, okay, SMEs are not in the scope, they are exempted of the CSRD, but on the other hand, due to the trickle-down effect, they are heavily impacted by the CSRD. The Commission is saying it's themselves, small and medium-sized enterprises do not have to implement or setting up a due diligence process, but they have to fulfill the due diligence requirements. So they are seriously impacted.
You have talked about unfair liability claims. Do you think this is something that is an issue with the legislation or not? Are SMEs adequately protected from unfair liability claims?
I didn't mention it, but
okay.
No, that you are mentioning it.
I see these are notes, but okay, all right, yeah.
No, but I think this is exactly one of the things that are missing. To put your question in a global or more global perspective, this is about the support measures that the Commission has foreseen in the directive. And I think this is also an argument in addition to say SMEs are in the scope, because otherwise the Commission would not foresee mitigating measures in the directive. But there is exactly the problem also with the directive at this moment. We welcome, of course, those mitigating measures, but they are certainly not sufficient. in order to help small and medium-sized enterprises to fulfill their due diligence obligations. And there, one of the main issues is that small and medium-sized enterprises do not have the necessary instruments to go further than the first tier. And this is a problem. Therefore, we would like to limit the due diligence to the first tier, because, as I said in the beginning, we want legislation that is workable and that works. And you cannot expect, not from a company, not from a citizen, not from an entrepreneur, that it does things on which or he has no influence. And an SME cannot influence further than the first tier.
Okay, I'd like to move on to JURI, Business and Human Rights Advisor at ABN AMRO. JURI, how does ABN AMRO go about due diligence? How does that work?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for organizing the event and having me here as well. What we do at ABN AMRO is we do take a risk-based approach when it comes to our due diligence. What we have done is we identified the salient environmental and social issues that are relevant for our client portfolio, and then we found which are the most high-risk sectors from a sustainability perspective that we should ask more questions to our clients.
Can you give us a couple of concrete examples of higher risk?
Yes, of course. So it's maybe nearby my home. I'm from the Netherlands, so we have a large problem of exploitation of migrant workers. They're exploited by temporary labor organizations, also by the companies they work. So the agricultural sector, for example, but also maybe somewhat farther from home, the cocoa sector in Ivory Coast. You know, I think many people know many examples of these kind of sectors.
I mean, do you have any suggestions of how the legislation could be modified or amended? What you're talking about is a voluntary thing that you're doing, right?
Yes, we do. So, let's start with that. I'm very happy that at this point we now have legislation upcoming on due diligence, because as Emily pointed out, it's now legislation on conduct rather than reporting or other things. And I would welcome to close the gap a bit more towards what's now expected by the OECD guidelines and the UNGPs, for example, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And I think the way to do that is for companies to take a risk-based approach as well. So that makes it more feasible for them. At this point, only large corporates or high-risk, in the smaller segment companies are in scope. And I don't think that approach of scoping is the right way. I think if you take the high-risk approach that I was talking about, the risk-based approach that I was talking about, then you can also include value chains, SMEs, and
Okay, good. Let's move on to Julia, right? Let me ask you, what is the take of Finance Watch on the scope of the proposal? Do you agree with the regime currently foreseen for the financial sector in the proposal?
Thank you for the question, and thanks as well for having me here. So a few reflections on the general scope, and then a couple of specific things on financial institutions, since this is kind of the heart of our work as well. On the scope in general, we think that the scope should at minimum be consistent with the scope of the accounting directive, as well as the scope of the CSRD, so the Sustainability Disclosure Regulation, for the mere reason that we have a quite good set of rules now on the CSRD, on the sustainability-related disclosures, and importantly, for those rules to be to bring actually impactful outcomes at the end, it's very important that they are supported by obligations to act on them, which would be this specific directive we are talking about here. So, which means that the scope should be enlarged to at minimum the large companies plus medium companies of the high impact sectors. On the financial institutions, we very much welcome the fact that financial institutions are also included in scope of the directive in general. I think I'll touch upon a couple of points which have already kind of a basis in the Commission's proposals, but where we think that could be a step further. So definitely the value chain of a financial institutions, I think logically is not exactly the same definition as the value chain of a company. So we do welcome certain specification which is provided in the directive, however it should not be limiting. Second thing is that financial institutions should also have specific tools which they can use to enforce to act on the potential or actual adverse impacts, which in particular should be their engagement policies, voting policies, depending of course on the type of the financial institution, and the right to terminate a relationship should also be included, but of course this should be like the measure of last resort. So we would very much welcome to see a broader set of tools which financial institutions, specifically given their specific and very important role in the economy, have at their disposal. And the last but not least is a very important point is the transition planning. So transition to specifically climate objectives, the objective of climate neutrality, which I think hardly somebody would doubt that this is the internationally and also at the European level agreed common point of convergence where we have to go, but also other sustainability targets. So we very welcome that there is still some, let's say, remainings of the provisions on this, but we see a clear need to strengthen the provisions on this, specifically the obligation of everybody who is in scope of the directive to have such a transition plan. The sustainability targets, apart from the climate neutrality, which I think is a universally recognized target in a sense, however, the Paris Agreement is not listed in the annex of the directive for unexplained reasons, but also the other sustainability targets should also be defined in compliance or in accordance with the taxonomy, the European taxonomy of sustainable activities. And so why is this important from the financial institutions' perspective is that we now see the financial institutions committing to transition, especially transition to climate neutrality, apart from all the rest of the sustainability objectives. And they use these transition plans that they have so far been coming up on the voluntary basis as a risk management instrument. So they kind of claim that they are having their risks in control because they have those transition plans. So we see that it is very important to make sure that those transition plans also are subject to the same standards and are robust, in particular also in prudential regulation. But for that, there needs to be an obligation in this directive to have those plans, to subject them to the standards, not only for the financial institutions themselves, but also for the companies, because crucially financial institutions depend on the information provided by their clients.
Do you think as the directive stands, how effective will it be in fighting greenwashing and fighting just ticking that box?
So that's exactly, I think, the point of strengthening the provisions so that it's not a box ticking exercise, exactly. So that this, and in this context, the director's responsibility, but also supervisory powers are also very important as an enforcement tool, right, to make sure like the standards are lived up to. Importantly, from the financial institutions' perspective, we are not only talking about greenwashing, but not also from financial institutions, but in general, we are talking here more like risk washing. Because if we are not mitigating the environmental, the social impacts, but in particular also the climate change related impacts, we are running huge risk for the whole of our economy and also financial system.
There's another hashtag due diligence, risk washing. Very interesting. What do you think about the fact that the way I read it is that ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Authority, will not have the authority to watch over this. They won't have supervisory, they will have maybe advisory. How much do you think does that take the teeth out of the tiger?
Okay, so that's a great question, I think. We do see that the directive has an intention to establish supervisory powers, right? We do not have any clarity, maybe like how exactly that would look like. But if it is even, I think we've heard the discussions that needs to be more clarity. Needs to be more convergence. I mean, supervisory convergence is a very big topic in general, not only in relation to this, but also to some very well-established areas. So we do see a clear need for that, and also, clear supervisory powers, clear enforcement powers. With respect to, again, coming back to the financial sector, because financial sector is a facilitator of many activities, and a lot of activities would not even happen if financial sector were not there. In parallel, maybe in relation to this, but also on a kind of a different note, we clearly see a need also for the financial supervisors to have a competence over the transition planning of financial institutions. So that would give it definitely more teeth, because I think there the process is somewhere established.
By the way, we just broke over 400 people connected now, I'm told. And don't be bashful. You can send in your questions via YouTube, the YouTube chat, and we hope to get to some of your questions as well. But we need to go to Gael, and Gael at the Federation for International Federation for Human Rights. What do you think about the scope? Does it go far enough? Let me guess. No.
Thank you. So yes, I'm taking the floor for FIDH, International Federation for Human Rights, so it's not a surprise that we consider that we can expand the scope. Actually, we are documenting a lot of situation on the ground in the value chain of European companies, and we have seen how the impact on human rights have absolutely nothing to do with the size of the company, the structure of the company, or the established relationship. So yes, EBR. So the fact that it is established listing or something else is with absolutely no impact on how population may be affected on the ground. So I would like perhaps also jump in of what have been said about the fact that SMEs are already affected by the proposal made by the Commission. That's pretty true, and that's result from the cascading responsibility. So for us, even from that perspective, it would be great to have SMEs in the ground, on the ground and on the scope of the directive. Indeed, we consider that due diligence is really about providing tools to the companies to be sure that they are really in position, in practice, to respect human rights. As Business Europe said in the previous panel, it is pretty clear that all companies have the obligation to respect human rights. And to do that, the best way to do that, it is to ensure that we know the situation and we have assessed the risk in the value chain. So that's the first point. The second point on EBR, so established business relationship, we consider that this notion, and in that subject, on that subject, we are also, in a way, agreeing with the companies, Business Europe and other. We consider that this notion is not adequate, finally, to answer to the situation and to really tackle the objective of the directive. So we propose to delete it. And we have a lot of argument around that. Of course, the fact that it is completely vague, we fully agree with that. The second thing is that that means that in practice, some SMEs that are in established business relationship with large company will have to apply the conditions that are provided by those large companies, and will be in a different situation and will not benefit from an equal treatment if you compare to other SMEs that are not in established business relationship. That's a huge problem. And we consider that it's not in line, finally, with what is required in EU law in terms of motivation of legislation, because it's not in line with the double objective of the directive. The first one, the respect of human rights. Of course, there is absolutely no reason to consider that an SME that is in established business relationship with a large company will have more obligation than another. And it's not even in full compliance with the other objective, that is to ensure a level playing field between the companies.
Let me, before I go to René Rapassi, MEP, I'd like to come back to Luc, because what about focusing on first-tier suppliers? That's something that Pedro was talking about over at Business Europe. What's your opinion on that?
I think I already said this. So we are also in favor to limit the due diligence to the first tier, as it is the direct influence and the only influence an SME has. May I reply to what Gail said? Because, in fact, I fully agree on what she has said. And she said something very important, which we welcome. She said SMEs need tools. This is exactly missing. And already in 2011, 11 years ago, our organization has called up the Commission to provide tools. It is in our position papers, you can check this. So we had proposed to the Commission to pool up together the resources of United Nations, from the ILO, also from NGOs, but in the time we have asked the help of the NGOs, and they said, sorry, we don't have the resources to help you. So to pool together the resources also from the embassies and the representations of the European Union in third countries in order to establish databases with companies that are reliable for our SMEs. Because our SMEs, if they want to trade with third countries, they cannot do the necessary checks. And it's not about not respecting the human rights, because of course the companies, the SMEs respect it here, but it is the non-respect of the human rights in third countries. And then the Commission has published there last year, I think, a publication concerning the respect of the fight against forced labor, with some guidelines which are completely not usable by small and medium-sized enterprises. So if you say, no, I mean, you cannot apply them, sorry, this is again a list as in the actual proposal of general norms that you have to check. Our SMEs need concrete tools to help them. And if we can do it together, no problem at all. As I said, 10 years ago already we asked to do so. And now, of course, it's in the proposal of the Commission, something similar, but not yet there. Mm-hmm. And we really need this. And then there is no problem at all for the SMEs. Huh?
Yeah, I think we've...
Let that be clear.
Yeah, it was repeatedly mentioned, I think, so far about tools. Gail, quickly on first tier, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. So, two issues. First, perhaps about tools, and after about the first tier. About the tools, I think that if we apply the proposal as it is in a way to companies, including SMEs, you have already a lot of tools, like the stakeholder engagement, We are in constant dialogue with specific companies to provide them with information about how human rights are respected on the ground. For example, you need to acquire land in Cambodia. We can provide you really concrete advice on how to ensure that you are not contributing to systematic violations that are occurring now in Cambodia on land grabbing. So I think that it is one. The second one would be a grievance mechanism. In that case, you have local communities that can provide a complaint to the company, and then you have a kind of warning and are better in better position to know what happened on the ground. But there is a lot of tools, the action plan, the policy, the commitment of the boards, all those things are tools for companies to really change their culture, better understand finally what does that mean to have impact on the value chain. On the first years, you said that for SMEs it will be really difficult to go beyond that because you have no leverage and because perhaps you have no knowledge or it's too demanding in terms of resources. I think we cannot say it like that. We do not have to make the confusion between the scope and the due diligence, the content of due diligence. So for sure, if something is completely beyond your leverage and beyond your knowledge, and that you have absolutely no means to know what happened on the ground and where are the last consumer, for example, there is absolutely no due diligence obligation to do specific due diligence to make regarding that. So you are not on the scope, but you are on the content of your diligence duties. And so that's different. And so that's the reason why to have the scope covering all the value chain is so important.
Okay, we could have a whole day talk about that, I think, but maybe we can come back to it. But first, I'd like to go over to René Repassi, MEP. You are navigating this directive through the Econ Committee, which cannot be very easy, I guess.
Well, navigating, I think it's a very nice word, depending indeed on the weather that is out there. Given that we are entering autumn, we all know what we have to expect on the sea. But given that I'm a lawyer by training, I know how to deal with heavy weather in front of courts. Now coming to this highly interesting panel, so thanks a lot to the four of you for the discussion that you had amongst each other and the statements that you were putting here to our hearing. It was certainly very helpful for an ongoing process that will still take its time, and certainly also in Econ, since our shared competence is precisely on how to treat financial services. And when we look at the directive, I believe this directive made a big, or the Commission made a big drafting mistake when they were proposing this directive, in a sense that they chose for an actor-based approach instead for a risk-based approach that we know from the OECD and the United Nations, which is already implemented by some on a voluntary basis. And then nevertheless trying to get the risk-based approach through the back door into the draft and trying to make a good mix out of it, which in my eyes has its faults and its flaws. And that's now what we are dealing with, and trying to get to repair this in a manner that it works, because I'm totally with Luc that says what we don't need is another ticking the box exercise, because that is helping nobody. It is an additional burden for any company, which is of course unproportionate for SMEs, and it doesn't help anybody on the ground. So in that sense, that is something we have to, that should definitely not happen. So in that sense, another thought that I would like to pitch here, another reason why we have some weird constructions in this draft directive, like the established business relationship, and I'm here totally with Gael that this is a notion that is only complicating things and it does not really add much. but also contractual cascading, was introduced because of legal consequences such as the director's duties and the civil liability. So the entire thought was about what do we have with these two instruments, and then the remainder was adapted to it. Whilst whole due diligence is, as JURI rightly said, about a risk assessment, and that we go for the highest risks and tackle them and prioritize them in order to make things better. So if you're looking at this, how can we improve this draft without getting rid of the good elements that are in there? And here I do have indeed a couple of questions to the panel. For Luc in particular, because this is really something that I'm thinking about all the time, what we do with the SMEs, because I'm totally with you, the 99% is a marketing trick. Contractual cascading ultimately leads to big companies shifting the burden to the smaller ones that have difficulties to deal with it. And when we are in a liability situation, big companies can simply say, I have a contract, so I'm not liable for whatever you're telling me. So in that sense, do you think if we take out contractual cascading in a sense that is currently in there and replace it by a broader way of how the interaction between big companies and SMEs is done, that would alleviate the situation for SMEs? For JURI, I had the question, knowing that you're an insider. Financial sector is in particular about its leverage power on those that actually should have the due diligence obligations. So what is your experience on this leverage power if you compare it before entering into a financial agreement with an undertaking and thereafter? How is leverage power thereafter? Because that is a gap, in my eyes, in the current proposal. In that context, for JURI and also for Julia, the question on, given that we have an actor-based approach, we also look at financial institutions as actors and then treat the actors, financial institutions, differently. Yet, does it really make sense to differ in terms of actors? But might there be a need to differ according to financial instruments, given that institutional investors, pension funds that have a certain action, a certain way of how they do their investment policies? Is there a need to differentiate according to instruments when we look at tools? And finally, when we look at the SMEs that are the missing tools, it's a question for Luc and also for Gael. I hear you that SMEs are the missing tools, and I'm wondering whether an approach like the Commission has it now in the proposal on the forced labor, would be one that works, that actually establishes a certain presumption of a human rights violation on the basis of publicly available reports of NGOs or international organizations, so that there is no need to go that much into detail. What is publicly available makes an assumption on the basis of which the Commission at least wants to act and authorities want to act on in the forced labor proposal. Is that an idea that could fly and could help to alleviate the burden of SMEs? Thank you very much.
So a lot of questions. Who would like to go first on this? Luc, you want to? Yeah. You were the first object of the question. Cascading liability.
Yeah, because I have the same problem as Laura. So it's also the age, I think, that is coming up. Cascading liability. I do not want to avoid an answer to your question, but my opinion does not count. I mean, I'm representing an organization which has organizations as members, and our opinions are based on the input of our member organizations. So I should check this if this would be good. If I may say my opinion, I think yes, but it will not solve the whole problem for the SMEs, because it's only for those SMEs who are in the supply chain. What is also our concern is the SMEs who are directly dealing, for example, with third countries, and for them this is not a solution, and therefore, again, there the issue of the missing tools is extremely important, because we want our SMEs to be responsible, to have a due diligence policy, We are committed to this. Our organizations, our members, our enterprises are committed to this, but they cannot deliver because they are missing the tools. And once again, I repeat it here, we want to do something, but we are missing the tools. The tools are not there. On your second question, with the forced labor proposal, I've quickly read it, but there I think we have a little bit the same problem, that there also the tools are missing for the SMEs to detect forced labor, because this is nearly impossible for an SME, if it's trading with a third country, to really distinguish in those countries when it's forced labor or not, or when, for example, it is how are you going to define labor done by prisoners? Of course, for China, it's clear, but often the instruments are missing, and there, once again, I think that there the neutral information from ILO, from embassies can help our SMEs. I don't know if this is an answer to your question. Okay.
I'd like to get to the other three speakers, but are there any questions out here that we'd like to get to before the end of this panel? All right, we'll get to you in just a second. If we could get brief answers from each of you as well. I think, Yuri, you were next in line on the questions, right?
Yes, I think it was. I should keep it brief. But to your first question about successes of engagement, I think first it's important, to address that the current proposal does not really include for financial institutions an ongoing due diligence process. It's only in the proposal that's only necessary to conduct due diligence at the pre-contractual phase, where I think that, and we think in how we do it, is that in this way it's you're not able to build leverage in a relationship, and you're not able to exert your leverage properly, because you should be able to keep on in ongoing discussions with your clients on E&S issues. So what we do in my experience, like you ask about our experience in engagement, we assess a client at the beginning of a relationship, dependent on the risk level of a client. We see whether or not we have to see this client next year again, so we can review the progress, so we can see the effects of our engagement, or in 3 or 5 years when there's less risk there. So we allocate our resources to the most severe and the risks that are most severe and most likely to occur. And based on that, we see, we think that it's really important to have ongoing discussions with clients as a financial institution, to make sure that improvement is really happening, because that doesn't work when you only do it at the pre-contractual phase.
Julia, please.
I'll start by totally agreeing with Yuri on this. I think that's a very important point, the ongoing due diligence. And I think that there is actually no apparent rule why the Commission went for pre-contractual only, because in a sense, if we really think back to the financial institutions' practices, it's not entirely new, right? The reputational risk management has been there a long time. Based on my personal also working experience, I might draw a parallel to the issues like anti-money laundering and human trafficking risk management, right? So this is not the same, but there are quite some parallels. And I think the financial institutions themselves, in that sense, have already quite a good experience. I think Yuri just alluded to that, of how they can do, which leverage they can use. And to answer your specific question, if we should differentiate between the instruments that financial institutions have at their disposal, or should be using, or have to be using, depending on the type of financial institution, on the type of relationship, that's for sure. I think this is also the types of relationship that financial institutions have, like, or types of financial institutions like pension fund versus banks or insurance, who have potentially more of a leverage, should also, I think, determine the importance or relative importance of pre-contractual versus ongoing due diligence, because certain things, especially if you are kind of a institution like pension fund or another like investor, like asset managing institution, you can have definitely much more leverage. Probably the only type of leverage is at this time of the selection of investment. So that puts a more onus on the pre-contractual one versus ongoing. Versus if you are financial institutions like a bank specifically, things like ongoing engagement, engagement policies, or also voting policies, they should be in there, and we also think that there should be more maybe examples and clarity in the legislation already there, apart from potentially the further guidelines that will come on the back of it. I think also we can also differentiate between leverage instruments like on a transaction basis, so financial institutions also support their clients like on transaction by transaction, like trade finance, for example, or underwriting business. So there can be more leverage also in terms of like refusing transactions without having to terminate necessarily the whole business relationship. So I guess we can like work into this at a very, very granular level. But to cut the long story short, yes, there is room for differentiation. I think it's definitely worth looking into that and also working with financial institutions to find a good kind of framework overall for that.
Okay, Gail, please. Gail? Yeah? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to...
Very briefly, though.
Yeah, on the second point,
Okay.
so I only thought about the first, react to the first point. So what I think about the differentiation is, I agree there, that there should be differentiation between, for example, account holders at a bank or lending clients or investment clients, because there's different types of relationships. But in the end, they're all business relations, and the OECD guidelines and the UN guiding principles are quite clear about how to go about discussing these kind of issues with your clients. And I think at this moment it's unclear whether account holders, account holders is not the right word, but I mean businesses who have only bank accounts with banks, are in scope at this moment. And I think they should be in scope, because it's also a business relationship, and the current international standards are quite clear on how to who to include, and that is also business relationships. Yeah.
Okay, Gail, please.
Thank you. On the different tools that we may set up, and the idea of having a database about the risks, or something like a specific list on areas that are at risk, or specific activities that are at risk. We think that what is really important is for sure to ensure that the process is not politicized, meaning that any idea, for example, to have a specific list of areas at risk that would have been made by the Commission itself, for example, may provoke and create some other risks. Like, for example, we have seen in the implementation of other regulations and legislations that having a specific country on a specific list may encourage finally the companies to invest in another country where there is also risks. So the main thing that FIDH would like to raise in that regard is that in any case we can escape of our own homework. So we need to make the assessment and the effort to try to identify, and this also with the help of the people that may be affected on the ground.
Can we have that quick question out there who was raising their hand? I think, was it you? Okay, very briefly, please.
you. Thank you so much. My name is Alina Kahle. I work for the human rights think tank, The London Story. And since this panel is called From Multinationals to SMEs, I wanted to zoom out to the multinationals again. And this question is probably mostly for FIDH or for MEP Ripasi. We have been engaging with Meta as a big tech platform quite closely regarding its annual human rights report, which claimed that it's a pioneer report, but which we know has not disclosed many things that we personally alerted them to regarding mass atrocities in India. Now, we know that there is the DSA in the European Union, which is a big victory, but given that this only requires mandatory risk disclosure, we're wondering to what extent big tech platforms / very large online platforms, VLOPs, should also be covered under this due diligence directive. And if it already is, whether it should be, and if it's not, whether it should be. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone on the panel like to comment, or René, before we wrap this up?
Maybe briefly
JURI,
then.
go ahead.
Yeah. I think Meta is an example of a high-risk company. It has high-risk activities from both a environmental and from a human rights perspective, as you also mentioned. So I definitely think that companies like Meta should be in scope of the legislation.
Okay, that was quick. Thank you very much. Thank you. A big hand to our panel. Julia, Gael, Luc, JURI. Yeah, I see a bit of hesitation here.
May
yes, Luc, but very briefly, because I got to go to the next one.
No, because I was, I like the remark of Gael in saying, okay, Commission cannot make a blacklist. That's why we are asking for a white list. But this is not a little bit hypocrite. I mean, Commission will not do this because this is indeed the reason they give, oh, we cannot do this. But and rightly, there can be some consequences. But I'm asking then a company who is dealing with a certain country, if it is stopping its activities, it has also consequences. Are they also not valid? And I think this is a very difficult question to answer, because normally for SMEs, also if they see something that's going wrong, the only possible solution is then ending the contract, with the consequence that maybe companies from third countries are taking their place, which are maybe even, which are worse. And this is really a dilemma. So I fully understand the political reasons for the Commission, but on the other hand, there are also sometimes for the SMEs reasons to stay. And I think also the issue of child labor, I think that everybody agrees that this is also a very difficult topic, what to do with child labor, and that there is no white and black solution for this. And therefore, I think that we should have a really balanced legislation, once again, something that is feasible and workable for everybody.
Okay. Luc, thank you very much. My thanks again to Luc, to JURI, to Gael, to Julia. A big hand to them, please. Again, I think each of these panels merit a whole day of talk, and yes, there's that idea of, if one company from Europe doesn't do the business, maybe somebody else will. There's that leakage idea, right? Like carbon leakage, same thing. So it's an issue, and there are also import restrictions involved there too, I believe. Can we call up our next panel on stakeholder involvement, burden or asset? We did touch on stakeholder involvement, and that's what we're going to drill down into. Christopher Patz, ECCI, European Center for Study of Culture and Inequality. Isabel Schumann, ETUC, that's the European Trade Union Confederation. Rob Lederer, CEO of the Responsible Business Alliance. which bills itself as the world's largest on corporate social responsibility in supply chains, representing companies like Apple, Amazon, BMW, Ericsson, Fujitsu, and on and on and on. So I hope to get to more of your questions during this final hour, and we do have to keep in mind, too, that we're going to lose our interpreters at 5 p.m. local time, so we want to keep parlons peu, mais parlons bien, as you would say in French. Let's keep it as terse as possible so we can get to all of the speakers and the questions. Let's begin with Christopher Patz. Christopher, are you here? Okay. Do you think, hello Christopher, do you think that stakeholder involvement is addressed enough in this directive or not?
Thanks, Chris. And I'll just correct the organization, if you don't mind. I'm from the European Coalition for Corporate Justice, representing around about 500 NGOs, trade unions, and consumer organizations who advocate for corporate accountability and access to justice for victims of corporate abuse from across Europe. To answer your question, I would give an affirmative no. And I would like to refer to the words of Saida Khatun, the Vice President of the Baldia Factory Fires Affectees Association, with whom I discussed in Pakistan last week, a couple of weeks ago, on the 10th anniversary of the Ali Enterprise factory fire, which killed about 300 workers, a lot of them underage. And I asked her this question about the importance of stakeholder consultation in due diligence, and her response was, companies need to talk to us because if they don't, how are they meant to know what problems we face? If companies speak to us, we can tell them what we see. We are the ones who have to face the risks, and we can tell them what needs to be done so that they can fix the problems. Now, that's a relatively simple statement, but I think we can extrapolate really quite a lot from that for the purposes of the proposal. The first of all is that the current proposal only asks companies to do stakeholder consultation, quote unquote, where relevant. Saida's simple point is that it's always relevant to do stakeholder consultation. If you are trying to identify the risks in your supplier base, you need to talk to the people who are facing those risks, and they will tell you. That's relatively simple. And a lot of companies espouse the effectiveness of this as an identification tool. Now, if you are a company and you have suppliers numbering in the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands, of course, there are other means by way of legitimate proxy organizations, global trade union confederations, organizations such as GAIL, who was sitting here before, who have global networks of civil society organizations on the ground. When you have identified risk areas, that factories in Pakistan are at risk, and you're sourcing from those factories, then you need to consult with the workers there in order to discern how you're going to address those impacts. And they're going to advise you on the most effective means of how you can protect their rights. Another area of key importance is remediation. Can you imagine a directive that requires companies to remediate people that have been harmed and not talk to them about what they need in terms of remediation? It's a gaping hole. And lastly, I would just say that there is a mandatory complaints mechanism in the directive, But if we just rely on this as the sole means of stakeholder consultation, I mean, this is resting on two assumptions. First of all, that it's the obligation of NGOs and CSOs to do risk assessments for companies. It's not. It's clearly the obligation of companies. Second of all, that we as NGOs and CSOs and trade unions have the resources to do that. It's companies, for-profit enterprises, who have the obligation to proactively reach out to stakeholders in their value chains. And lastly, I would say, even if it was to rest on us, the directive does nothing in terms of supplier transparency. How are we meant to know to make a complaint that this factory is producing for CNA, for instance, because there's no information. The way we got that information after Rana Plaza and Ali Enterprise was by going through the shirts and looking at the labels on the jeans amongst the dead bodies to find out, oh, this is a factory which was producing for CNA. So we need that disclosure information as well in order for stakeholders to use a complaints mechanism effectively. Thanks.
More transparency. Isabel, what about the role of trade unions in engagement? What should that role be, and how do you see the directive on that?
Thank you so much for giving us the floor. Of course, there is a role for trade unions and for workers' voice. What a question. And I think this is, from a trade union side, I would say there is a business case for the involvement of trade unions workers, likewise business case for the involvement of stakeholder in general, and I speak here also with NGOs. And in particular, because this is how you do good business. And what we've seen, if we are serious with the game changer that could be this directive on corporate sustainability due directive that was previously named mandatory human rights due diligence and responsible business conduct. And I think here the change of the name might give us some hint where we are going to. If we are serious with going to do good business, then we should be serious with our values. And I wonder, exactly like Chris, why the Commission's in this draft proposal has not respected the existing legislation, being at the national level, being at the European level, since at least the 70s. And here I speak for the need for information, consultation, participation for any development at the business level when it comes to employment, when it comes to working conditions, when it comes to the investment, when it comes to merger, when it comes to looking for suppliers and subcontractors. And I think here, if we want to be serious, we have to be part of this directive because we are part of the solutions and we are part of the prevention that is needed to prevent human rights violation. Here, clearly, do not create a second-class human rights. Workers' rights are human rights. And I think this is clearly the case, and it is not just at the European level, because it's what I hear. This is European values we cannot transport outside in the world. This is ILO values that should be respected worldwide. And I think, do not tell me either that you don't find workers everywhere in the world, nor trade unions. That's wrong. There is an international trade union confederations that speak for workers in the world. You have European trade union confederations I'm speaking for today. We have workers and workers representative anywhere. Just let them represent the workers. And I think this is exactly where we can make the difference here in Europe.
Rob, how much is it in the interest of big companies like the ones that you represent through your Responsible Business Alliance? How much is it in their interest to do more of this stakeholder engagement?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for the opportunity to be here. I had to laugh in your opening statements earlier today when you talked about you hoped that the American community was watching. I happen to represent that American community, and we're watching as the world is watching. And I think all of our best hope is that this regulatory directive, when it comes out, will be that sort of example around the world of how you can legislate responsible sourcing regardless of where it is. You know,
I think that's a hashtag due diligence there.
There you go.
Somebody send that out.
There you go. And I will say, you know, The RBA has members that do business in over 120 countries around the world. They're large multinational companies in many cases. They represent those large supply chains in the thousands in many cases, which is not unusual. We are a tools provider that provides the tools in many cases, not to substitute the individual company's responsibility, to provide the tools so that they can live in to those responsibilities regardless of the size of the company. And I would say that stakeholder engagement is one of those very important tools. In fact, one of those very essential tools. And it certainly is a core of what we do. We use stakeholder communities as an early warning sign in the field and in the regions so that our members, our organization, our companies can understand what those challenges are.
Can you give a concrete example of that?
Sure, yeah. We, well, through a whole variety of things. It's essential. We do audits. We know audits take a bad rap around the world. We don't think all audit programs are the same, but the audits, successful audits, it's essential to have worker engagement in those audits and front and center in everything that we do. We offer retaliation tools for workers who participate in those interviews. We make it the foundation of our process. We collaborate with local NGOs, for example, on worker grievance programs that we've piloted all around the world.
Okay, but you're still talking generically. Is there an example of stakeholders who are seeking justice and got it?
I mean, yeah, we think so all the time. I mean, I'll give you a general, and you know, we've seen over $100 million in worker fees paid back of workers that are in forced labor through that combination of stakeholder engagement, through our tools and services. And through the due diligence that our industry practices. And so that we would use that as a very clear example of the effectiveness of governments, industry, stakeholders, NGOs, civil society working together in the places that we operate in.
Can I pitch this out to the audience real quick? Is there a question out there before we move on to Rafael Glucksmann? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Davinia Ovet-Bondi from Save the Children. So you're mentioning stakeholder engagement, and obviously children are affected by adverse impacts, the high risks, for example, in relation to child labor, but also other impacts. So could you tell us, maybe Mr. Patz, but also the other panelists, what you would envisage in order to strengthen stakeholder engagement of children in the directive? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I think it goes to the broad point of the need for quality requirements for stakeholder consultation, with special consideration for particularly vulnerable groups which companies need to take into consideration. Not all stakeholders have the capacity to represent themselves in a coherent manner that adults would understand. So in that case, yeah, proxy organizations or agencies such as the UN Agency for Children's Rights, or organizations such as yourself, dare I say, would be, you know, in that case, responsible for representing the rights of children to companies. However, I think arguably more important would be local groups who know the situation for children in areas where risks have been identified by a company. If there are particular risks to children, then yeah, their guardians and representative organizations would need to be consulted. But the broader point about the need for quality requirements for stakeholder consultation, you know, if it's for children, if it's for indigenous communities, the OECD does have elaborated guidance on this as well. And so that's one source of inspiration that we, for our part, would like to see elaborated in, say, recitals or guidance. Yeah.
Okay. Isabel, Rob?
Children do not belong to businesses nor to companies. And I think this is a clear statement that we should be well aware of. So if we ban products coming in the European Union because they're based on forced labor, they should also be banned when they come from child labor. And I think this is clearly where we stand. I'm totally with Chris. If there is child labor in a business, we have to make sure that we are in very close relationship with those who are using children for doing their business so that they stop doing that, and that we propose to the children and their parents schooling so that the children goes to school and not to the factory.
And how do you deal with that in a complex supply chain? Do you have an example of that, Rob, where it actually works?
I think it all goes down to the importance of the local level and on the ground. We're an organization that's on the ground. We're practicing responsible sourcing. And if this directive has a requirement of companies, which we support, by the way, to have a responsible sourcing program in place of their supply chains, for example, in the German law, it requires a worker grievance mechanism to be in place for those supply chains, a tool that we have worked very hard on providing factories all around the world, wherever they are, so that children, workers, local NGOs, civil societies can tap into that worker grievance mechanism that we offer throughout the world, so that we get that early warning signal, and then we can address it through our compliance activities.
So you think that the way that the directive is drafted now is okay, or should it be reinforced on that stakeholder engagement question?
I think, the directive ought to be very clear that companies, A, should be responsible if they cause harm directly on anybody. 2, that they should have a responsible due diligence program in place to monitor their supply chains, and that they should have the tools and access to the tools, which we think they can get through industry schemes like the RBA, to be able to monitor that and bring both relief and remedy when issues arise.
Okay. Let's go to Raphael Glucksmann, who's on the Human Rights Committee, and you are the navigator for that, the rapporteur for the directive there. What you've heard so far, a bit of reaction?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to our panelists, because I think it's obviously one of the key debates we should have on this directive now. I mean, you have several words in the directive that are the products of this quest for equilibrium that sometimes leads to problematic formulations. Established business relationship, you already spoke about it, is clearly one of these expressions that's problematic. Then you have this where relevant. I mean, this expression is really an issue for us, and we will delete it wherever we can find it, because it's always relevant, and as Chris has said. So from our perspective, it's very important that this is considered today one of the main points, because in droit, the stakeholders will be at the center of our concerns, obviously. And I have several questions. I have a question on the access to justice, because one of the weak points, I think, but then I want your point of view, is on access to justice for impacted stakeholders. So what's your assessment? What should be changed? Then you have an experience in responsible business in RBA on remediation. You spoke a bit about it, but last time we had a discussion, I think you can even expand your explanation on that. What do you think should be drawn as a lesson from your expertise for this directive to change on the remediation, and what's the role of stakeholders in the definition of remediation? Then I have an issue, and this is coming from the Human Rights Committee, obviously, which is the problem of not defining specific protection against risks for stakeholders that are involved in the process. Because obviously you have stakeholders who are targeted because they raise concerns and they raise alarms. So what do you think should be the good practice on that, and how we can change the directive so that actually we take into account the fact that we need to protect those who are getting involved in the process itself? And then my last question that's connected to this one is what do we do in specific situations when we, for instance, have to face state-sponsored forced labor or situation, and where stakeholders cannot actually be active because of obvious direct security reasons. I mean, what do we do, to be concrete, in China with Uyghur forced labor? How do we interact? How do we make them part of the process if you have a totalitarian state that is actually controlling everything? So that's also to underline that if we want this directive to be very ambitious and enforceable, we have to take into account that it will apply to different kind of situations. And we need to plan for all of these situations, including the hardest ones. So thanks again. Sorry for having too many questions, but more you enter into the details of the directive and the discussions, the more questions you have. It's obvious.
Interesting that you raise that thing about totalitarian states. Is that there a comment recently by the German labor minister that this due diligence could actually put pressure on governments like that? What do you think?
Well, if we have an ambitious directive and we combine it with the import ban on the product of forced labor, yes, obviously it will have an impact. And this is precisely what we want to do. This is not directed at any foreign government. It's a universal legislation, obviously. But of course, where you have state-sponsored forced labor, we should have political pressure. And we should have also a questioning of whether or not we should disengage. But this is another discussion, and I want the panelists to respond to the question.
Another can of worms. Chris, do you want to kick it off?
Sure, I would like to, and I guess I would just start with the point that this point on access to justice is indeed something that, in our view, really requires an entire conversation. I mean, there are people in this room who have been bringing court cases unsuccessfully against European transnationals for overseas harms for literally decades without success, and we really need dedicated attention to this issue. I mean, the European Union and all the member states signed up to the UNGPs in 2011, and there they all dedicated under Pillar 3 to improve access to judicial remedy for victims of corporate abuse, and they've done nothing on that so far. So, I mean, we really need to discuss that, and to your point, I would say several things. First of all, that the liability formulation does not give enough consideration to the power imbalances between corporates and victim plaintiffs. I'm talking here about the need for a fair distribution of the burden of proof. At the moment, victims are left to prove that the company's due diligence was not up to scratch, as well as the harm and as well as the causation. This involves studies, environmental harm studies that are incredibly expensive. These are transnational human rights cases, incredibly expensive to bring. We need to follow the precedent of other directives such as the Anti-Discrimination Directive, which do have a reversal of the burden of proof. It's completely reasonable to do this in civil procedure. There's many precedents, so that's the first thing we would call for there. The other things that we would call for are limitation periods being amended. You know, if you're bringing a transnational human rights or environmental case, it can take up to years just to find out who the victims are. And also collective redress as an efficient, we know from the data that the majority of corporate abuses are instances of collective harm. So it makes sense to have collective redress for the efficacy and efficiency of the judicial procedure. I'll leave it to the other speakers on the other points on stakeholder consultation, but just put in a last word there to say, because Rob may have stopped short of completely endorsing mandatory stakeholder consultation throughout the directive. I'm not sure if I understood you right, Rob, but there is a letter down here on the table signed by 44 investors and corporates endorsing mandatory stakeholder consultation throughout the directive. And it's signed by some pretty gruesome companies like Nestle, for instance. You've also got Unilever on there. So I dare say that these are guys who know from experience that the best way to avoid litigation is to do stakeholder consultation.
I guess that goes to Rob. What do you think?
Well, thank you. I mean, first of all, as I said earlier, I think these all tie together. And as the directive, if the directive is clearly defines that companies should have a responsible sourcing due diligence program in place on their supply chains, and it's clear, we think that is a plus in the directive. We think that you don't need to rewrite many of the sections on remediation and stakeholder engagement, and they can refer to the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines that have very clear sections on that. And the stakeholder guidance, it says it's the responsibility of the company first research who are the impacted stakeholders, and once those are identified, that they be directly involved as a right, and certainly the worker has a right to be a social partner in that remediation. We support. So we say there's a great framework already in place, either through the UNGPs or the OECD guidance in those areas.
Just to mention, we're over 500 people connected now, and we're very happy to have all of you connected with us.
They waited for panel 3.
I guess that's probably it. Yeah, the big show. Emily, you had something very quickly to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. No, I just wanted to touch on the stakeholder engagement from the OECD perspective. And hi to Raphael Glucksmann. Yeah, I think it's worth, sometimes I feel like we need to be a bit more specific about what we're talking about. So when we're talking about own operations causing harm in your own operations, there is a very clear expectation in our standards on stakeholder engagement and who that means, i.e. it's going to mean potentially impacted or impacted stakeholders. When we're talking about contribution situations, similar. When we're talking very far down the supply chain, then we're talking about leverage and influence and understanding the leverage and influence that the company should be putting onto the suppliers to be engaging, to be remediating, to be addressing the harms. So it is that, it's easy to say stakeholder engagement everywhere, but I think we have to think through what that really means, and it's incredibly important and very central to our standards. And I think certainly with the UNGPs as well, that the idea that impacted stakeholders' perspectives are taken into account should run through, but that there are, through the whole directive, but there are there are points when it really matters, like the tracking, like the identification at the site level in your own operations, in your factories, or it's the supplier doing it at their factory, So I think there needs to be very clear where the responsibility is. It needs to happen. Yeah, just to clarify that. Thanks.
Okay, I kind of wonder, Isabel, how do we prevent this from becoming stakeholder management instead of stakeholder engagement? And I also wonder, with this directive, you think, I know Raphael had a bunch of questions, but if this directive were in place several years ago, and there probably are a number of European companies involved in building the World Cup facilities in Qatar, could we have prevented some of those deaths?
I think we have to make clear that we have to move ahead and make a step further in terms of where we are with the OECD guidelines and where we are not. And I think where we are not is clearly why Germany has moved on with the legislation at the national level. Because despite a lot of businesses saying we comply, we apply the OECD guideline, they didn't. 20% of the whole business community that were so-called involved and complying were not. So I think we have to be clear. We have to have the possibility to send the signal to businesses is not voluntary anymore, whether or not you comply with human rights. You have to. You have to, because it's your responsibility to do business not on the back of workers and on the back of the communities. And I think this is exactly where the difference will be made. When we make this voluntary setting, which is still, if we are clearly looking at the text of the directive, is still there. It's unilateral. Businesses are still judge and jury at the same time. They decide when, with whom, and on what. And so far, that has not worked. And I think if we don't change that, then we will be nowhere and it will be an empty shell. And an empty shell which is really given kind of ammunition for those in Qatar who says, well, we built that famous sport arena for the whole world, and no one is saying anything.
Just to interject, according to a 2020 European Commission study, only about a third of businesses surveyed do environmental and human rights due diligence, and only 1 in 8 cover the entire supply chain. So that kind of reinforces your argument. Is there another question out there? Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Hendricks. I am the head of EU Affairs for Technology Industries of Finland. First of all, thank you very much for this very illuminating and interesting discussion, and perhaps also to quickly introduce our point of view. The TIF is very much in favor of due diligence regulation, and we believe that this is the right way forward because only a comprehensively responsible business is also a successful business. But my question is actually a question that has already been asked, but I'm not entirely sure if it's been fully addressed, because Raphael Glucksmann asked the question about what to do if we are dealing with a totalitarian state such as China, and essentially what can be done essentially, because this obviously goes to the question of essentially to what extent is this, where can essentially business act, where is it the responsibility of states to act, and where that line essentially becomes difficult to tread essentially, what is there the best way to do?
That's a big question. Chris, do you want to deal with that?
Sure. I mean, I can have a stab at one part of it, and that is the need for stakeholder consultation to be made anonymous and confidential from the company side, so that the identification of the complainants, if they are a human rights defender in Xinjiang or in Bolsonaro's Brazil, that they will not be subject to retaliation. And I would take the opportunity just now to plug an event after this one where Brazilian human rights defenders will be screening a documentary and telling their stories of the Brumadinho Dam collapse. So I would encourage you all to go to that event. It's Benelli 3G2, because if we are discussing stakeholder consultation on an all-European panel, indeed conference, we might be missing the point a little bit. So I would just encourage you all to get along to that next event. But yeah, confidential and anonymous stakeholder consultation routes. And I believe there's some inspiration from the whistleblower directive that we may be able to take on as well.
So, Isabel, where does the responsibility lie? I think that's the question, right?
No, I think it's very right to use the whistleblower as a kind of model that goes beyond Europe. And I think this is also what we hope the CSDD will go beyond Europe and make the difference here in terms of respect and protection. And I think the protection dimension is key. This is one element that is throughout the European legislation, so that you protect the one who defend others, and in particular the weakest part of a contractual relationship, which is on one side, of course, the employers, and on the other side, the workers. And I think the more you go through the supply chain, the more you see these discrepancies and this unbalanced situation. Now, when it comes, when it comes to doing business with autocratic regimes, well knowing that the whole is not even respecting or thinking of respecting human rights, and I think here the CSDD could play a role indeed, because it will responsibilize the businesses, but we have also to make sure that there is a link with the trade policy of the European Union. And here I would like to appeal that here we have also a sustainability impact assessment that should be done when there are negotiations between the European Union on one side and another state on the other side. And unfortunately, currently, this sustainability impact assessment comes after the agreement, so much too late in terms of impacting whether or not to do business with this country and on which basis.
Rob, anything else to add there?
I would just say I'm going to make a general statement across the board. Regardless of where the factory is located, regardless where we implement a tool on behalf of our member companies, whether it's audits or risk assessment tools or wherever, issues need to be addressed by companies when they're identified and when they're found, wherever they are. And as is outlined in the OECD guidance, it's the obligation of the company, and we support very strongly to work with those companies to rectify and to remedy the situation, as opposed to first reaction is to just withdraw or take their business somewhere else, because in the end, all that does is leaves the workers in that same vulnerable situation. But we are realistic and to understand enough to understand that if there is a situation wherever it is in the world where you can't remedy that situation, then companies have no other result but to make a B2B decision to withdraw, regardless of where it is. And I'll leave that statement at that point, but I think everybody can read between the lines.
Okay. We have a question over here, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Neva Nachtigal. I'm from Clean Clothes Campaign. We're a global network of over 230 trade unions, NGOs.
The which campaign, you said?
Clean Clothes Campaign.
Clean Clothes Campaign.
Yes.
I know that one.
We're trying to improve the working conditions in the garment industry. And I would like to touch upon, I'm happy that it was mentioned again now, the point of audits, because we are one of the industries that is characterized by a lot of auditing. And we have shown time and time again how seriously flawed this auditing industry itself is. And the example that Chris started with of LA Enterprises, for example, where hundreds of workers died, is one example of both a failure of auditing as well as of lack of access to remedy. So I want to basically have your perspective on this point that we're making, that basically, or I want to make this link between the auditing and stakeholder engagement, in the sense that as audits are conducted currently, they can only serve as an example of how not to do stakeholder engagement. So one thing that we really do not want to see in practice is that auditing industry would boom after this due diligence directive comes into place, and companies acting as if hiring an auditing company is then adequate proof of due diligence, because it is not. Workers are interviewed on site, they fear retaliation, they're coached beforehand by their managers. I mean, I could continue about this and I won't. I invite you to read our report that's called Fig Leaf for Fashion, where we show how the auditing industry is really structurally flawed. So what we would like to see is, in fact, a move away precisely from this commercial auditing industry and towards stakeholder engagement as a tool, indeed for an actual quality stakeholder engagement as a tool for monitoring and identifying risks. And I would just like to hear a comment from the panel on this link between audits as we see them now, or as maybe they see them in the future, and stakeholder engagement. Thank you.
Okay, Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, well, look, thank you very much for that question, because it's one we're passionate about as well. And I'm going to say this in general. Not all audit programs are the same. I'll leave it at that, and we'd love to sit down and share with you how we approach audit programs and how we conduct worker interviews on-site, off-site, and through social media. And some of the integrity points, checkpoints in our particular program, we're not in the garment industry, but certainly would love to sit down and talk to you about that. But here's where the flaw is and the mistake is made in my viewpoint. You have to look at a responsible due diligence program as more than just an audit. All does an audit do, in our viewpoint, it's a tool in the toolbox. It's an important tool in the toolbox because it's one of the ways we have as companies and as industries to get into the factory to determine what's going on. We start our responsible due diligence process first as a risk assessment tool that looks both at that factory before an audit is ever conducted to evaluate the risk of that factory. If they're a high-risk factory, then that's when we'll engage in an audit. And I want to say again, an audit is a tool. We think it's a good tool, but all it does is tell you what's going on in that factory at a point in time. What it doesn't tell you is how to remedy it, how to rectify it, and how to ensure that it doesn't come back. So 2 years later, you go to do a re-audit and you get the same findings that you had 2 years ago. And so where we try to spend most of our space is after the audit, and what we call a corrective action plan. How do you work with the factory? How do you identify the issues? What do you put in place to deal with that? And that's where the real magic happens. And I'll say it again, it's not at the audit, it's at the continuous improvement. And then come back at the end with what we call a closeout audit to ensure that they're done. But you got to complement that whole process with things like worker grievance tools that are effective, with stakeholder engagement, with stakeholders at the local level that they're there, that should be a part of the process. So where any legislation that just focuses on audits is a tremendous weakness. It has to focus on the entire due diligence journey, which we think starts with risk assessments, not company size, not where you are in that supply chain, but on risk assessment, and then goes all the way through the process. But we do include audits as an important part of that as well.
Okay, I want to go to Phil, but is there a quick comment either from Isabel or Chris on answering this question?
Just briefly, I think it's auditing, but you can add certifications. You could also add reporting. All of that, I fear, is becoming a ticking the box exercise just to get the possibility to do business independently of whether your due diligence plan strategy is developing, is involving trade unions, workers, and NGOs. All of that should be very watched out, because for the moment, the development goes in that direction, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, Chris, very, very briefly, please.
Yeah, and I think, Rob's point that audits are just one tool of many does not justify their prioritized status in the text of the directive. If they did work, that would be justified. But of course, history has shown otherwise. So our mantra is reprioritizing stakeholder consultation and deprioritizing audits.
Okay, and a final word from Phil Bloomer, Business and Human Rights Resource Center, Resource Center, please, Phil.
Thanks very much. Just very quickly, I wanted to come back on the issue of, this whole issue of due diligence in conditions of conflict and repression. And I think it's important that we recognise, first of all, that the UN guiding principles in particular speak directly to those conditions and demand heightened due diligence from companies, not because heightened due diligence is better but per se, but because it's fundamentally important that companies do play a full responsible role in not creating new drivers for conflict or new triggers for worsened conflict. And so it's from that position that there is very clear guidance, and that should be fully incorporated into the due diligence directive. I mean, to give you just one example, after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we've gone to 300 companies and asked them for their heightened due diligence approaches. We've had 30 that have provided very strong and effective responses to that, but there's 270 that have not. And so that again demonstrates the importance of the mandatory nature of the due diligence directive. And I could just finish with the value chain issues are critically important in this as well. If you look at the role of Meta, for instance, or Facebook as it was in Myanmar, they played a fundamentally nefarious role there that has issued a significant rebuke from the United Nations. They've got $120 billion of profit this year, and they still do not have an individual with the language skills in all the countries where they're operating, where hate speech and misinformation can be a really big issue. And so that downstream due diligence as well as upstream due diligence is fundamentally important.
Yeah, very, very important to point out. Lara Walters, it's a very informative 3 hours here. Can you sum this up somehow?
I can't. I certainly can't, and I won't try. But I suppose I just want to close on some reflections here. I think that the number of people in this room and the number of MEPs involved in this all are testimony to the fact that this is a test case on building back better. I got very tired of that phrase during COVID, but I really think that is what we're doing here. I think that it's a test case to see how we deal with the risks of greenwashing that were mentioned, risk washing, cowboy companies, but equally doing right by those companies that are trying hard to do the right thing. I sense momentum politically. I sense excitement, even in this room, and what I ask of participants today and all those involved in this in one way or another, be it through lobbies, organizations, CSOs, etc. What I ask is your commitment to a meaningful law, even when the seas get rough and difficult to navigate. And that will require stamina, but that is my ask to you today. Because they will get rough and things will become difficult when we start really going into the weeds on those issues of access to justice, on remedy and stakeholder engagement, liability, tier 1, company scope. And those issues are difficult, but there's a number of other ones that were touched upon today that I think we could fill an entire week of discussions with. I think children's rights were mentioned. Animals' rights today weren't mentioned, but I think what goes into a hamburger, for instance, is a question that could see 3 hours of discussion just in itself. The role of tech companies was touched upon. ICT, illegal surveillance, censorship, hate speech, discrimination. There too, there's a lot for us to explore and to get right, and even 3 hours isn't enough to do that. We talked about conflict zones in the end. I think we talked about what to do, when to disengage in situations of conflict or institutional difficulty. We talked about the Wild West, I think, in auditing, but also about auditing that is useful. About the difficulties in the financial sector, the difficulties of maybe distinguishing between financial institutions and financial products, and the role of institutional investors, and all of those. I think we could talk a lot more. But unfortunately, this is what we have time for today. And I just mentioned totalitarian states. I know Rafael would have a lot more to say on this, but I think that provides a nice segue for me to say that China is watching us. The US is watching us, as we said at the beginning, so it's really in our interest to get this right. It's in our interest to make legislation here that can serve as a blueprint. And apart from those watching us, I want to thank the, I think, 1,000 eyeballs that we have connected now, and I want to warmly thank them for their participation. Lastly, there is a film screening organized by my colleague, Marie Arena, which is in 3G2 at 5:30. I warmly thank her for organizing that, and I would recommend that everyone in this room goes there. I certainly will go there. And lastly, I wanted to thank Helene and Andrea from the S&D again with some flowers, because this room full of people required a lot of organization. And thank you, and to all participants again.
Our thanks also to the interpreters. Thanks to the interpreters. And to all the speakers. And hopefully you can cast this all wider, as Lara was saying, that we need to get the word out and keep the momentum. So hashtag due diligence of anything you heard or would like to talk about from this event. Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks to you. Thanks to those watching and the interpreters. I'm Chris Burns. See you next time. Thank you.